In conclusion, Your Honor, my mother said, turning in the witness chair, so the whole courtroom could see her face, my daughter has never truly valued that house. She doesn't appreciate where it came from, she doesn't understand how to manage it, and she certainly can't protect it. It was always meant for me. Finally, your house is mine. The last sentence came out almost like a sigh of relief, as if she were stepping into a pair of shoes that had been waiting for her all along. A low murmur rolled through the gallery. Someone behind me whispered, "Did she just say that out loud?" The court reporter's fingers flew over her keyboard. On the bench, Judge Hall's eyebrows lifted, just a millimeter, before her expression smoothed back to neutral. At the respondent's table, I didn't move. I kept my hands folded neatly on the stack of documents in front of me, the trust, the medical records, 10 years of tax receipts, and focused on the judge, not on the woman whose voice had raised me and cut me in equal measure. Inside, though, the words sliced down old scars. Finally, your house is mine. I'd heard different versions of that line my entire life. When I was 6 and knocked over a vase in the front hallway, she'd hissed, "You're lucky your grandmother lets us live in my future house." When I was 13 and wanted to repaint the attic room, she'd snapped, "Don't you dare change anything in my house without asking." When I'd moved back in to care for my grandmother during her last year, she'd stood in the driveway and said, "Enjoy playing owner while you can. When she's gone, it comes to me." But hearing her say it here, under oath, in a courtroom packed with strangers, that was new. Judge Hall cleared her throat. "Ms. Ramirez," she said to my mother, "this is not a place for final claims. It is a place for evidence. Please answer only the questions asked." My mother pressed her lips together, as if physically holding back more words. Her lawyer, a slick man in a navy suit, leaned over to whisper something in her ear. She nodded, schooling her face back into injured dignity. I glanced sideways at my attorney, Leah Patel. She met my eyes, gave the smallest of nods that seemed to say, "This helps us more than it helps her." Then she looked back at her legal pad, already adjusting her outline for cross-examination. "My name is Elena Ramirez. I'm 37 years old, a high school English teacher in Atlanta, Georgia, and the house my mother was trying to rip out of my life is a 2-story brick home at the corner of Ashby and Linden that smells like old books, cafe, Bustelo, and every version of myself I've ever been. Before I tell you how that house ended up at the center of a lawsuit and why my own mother decided the only way to secure her future was to declare in open court that it was finally hers, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a parent look at something that keeps you safe, a home, a savings account, a small business you built, and treat it like a prize they've been unfairly denied? If you've ever felt that twist of betrayal, that moment when mom or dad starts to sound more like opponent, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. You'd be shocked how many of us grew up thinking family was a shield, only to find out later they were quietly sharpening knives behind it. The Ashby house came into our lives before I did. My grandparents, Mateo and Ana Ramirez, bought it in the early 70s, back when the west side of Atlanta was mostly brick row houses and corner stores, not cafes and yoga studios. My grandfather worked the line at a factory. My grandmother cleaned offices downtown at night. Every extra dollar went into a mayonnaise jar hidden under a loose floorboard in their tiny apartment until there was enough for a down payment. When they finally signed the closing papers, my grandfather carried my father, who was 3 at the time, up the creaky wooden steps and said, "Mijo, this is ours. No one can force us to leave because their cousin wants the building. No more moving every year." My father told me that story 100 times growing up. He never told it angrily. If anything, his voice always held a kind of wonder, like part of him still couldn't believe solid walls could belong to people like us. My mother never shared that wonder. She married my father at 19, Mostly, I think, because she was tired of sharing a two-bedroom apartment with 3 siblings and a mother who never stopped working. The Ashby house, with its built-in bookshelves and sunroom and fenced backyard, must have looked like a promise. But promises, in her mind, were always negotiable. Your grandparents are old-fashioned, she'd say, looking around the dining room with something sharper than affection. They think owning a house means living in it until you die. They don't realize what they could do with a place like this. Refinance. Flip it. Use it to get somewhere better. Where's better? I'd ask. She'd wave a manicured hand. Alpharetta, Roswell, somewhere with new construction and good schools. Not this old thing near the MARTA line. When they're gone, I'm not staying here and watching the paint peel. My father would roll his eyes and murmur, "It's not for sale, Lila," like he'd said it 100 times already. "It will be," she'd answer, "one way or another." As a child, I learned to read those arguments the way other kids read weather reports. The house was my favorite place on earth. The creak of the stairs, the smell of my grandmother's arroz con pollo simmering all afternoon, the way my grandfather's laughter filled the living room during soccer games. But I also learned that, for my mother, the house was both trophy and trap, a symbol of everything she thought she deserved and everything she believed was holding her back. By the time I hit middle school, the neighborhood had begun to change. Coffee shops crept in where auto body shops had been. Property values climbed. Men in clean polos started leaving glossy flyers in our mailbox. "We buy houses for cash." My mother saved every one. "Do you see this?" she'd say, thrusting a printout in front of my grandparents. "They'll give you 4 times what you paid. We could each get a condo and still have money left." My grandmother would look over her glasses. "We already have a roof and a garden and neighbors who bring food when you're sick." She'd reply, "What else do I need?" Security, my mother would say through clenched teeth. Retirement. Options. It took me years to understand that for her, the only real security was money she could personally touch and spend. A house that belonged to her parents was just a stubborn asset locked in someone else's name. And when my father died, suddenly of a heart attack when I was 22, leaving no will and only a small life insurance policy, that hunger hardened into something uglier. At the funeral reception, over paper plates of pastelitos, I overheard my mother telling a cousin, "At least there's the house. When my parents go, I'll finally have something solid. I deserve that much." I remember standing in the doorway to the kitchen, still smelling my father's cologne on my shirt, feeling like I'd stepped into a stranger's life. My grandmother caught my eye from across the room. For a second, the sadness in her face gave way to something sharper. Later that night, when everyone had gone home, she poured us each a cup of thick hot chocolate and said, very quietly, "Mija, we need to talk about what happens when I'm gone, before other people start talking for me." I didn't know then that a single conversation at that worn kitchen table would one day mean the difference between keeping my home and watching my mother auction it off to the highest bidder. But my grandmother did. The first time my grandmother mentioned a trust, I thought she meant trust like in relationships. Faith, loyalty, the invisible thread between people who don't hurt each other on purpose. Legal trust, she corrected, tapping a brochure from the law clinic at her church. Paper trust, the kind that speaks when I'm not here to explain. We'd been sitting in the kitchen, the house hushed around us. My grandfather had died the year before after a long illness, and the rhythm of the place had shifted. One less coffee mug in the sink, one less pair of shoes by the door. "I already have a simple will," she said, spreading several sheets of paper across the table. "It says the house goes to your father, or, if he is gone, to your mother." That made sense when they were young. But now, she let the sentence trail off, listening to the old refrigerator hum. "Now you've seen how your mother talks about this place," she continued. How many times she's tried to convince me to sell. How she looks at investors' flyers like love letters. If I leave the house to her, it will be gone within 6 months. I do not want my life's work turned into someone's granite countertop in the suburbs. Guilt prickled under my skin. She's just scared, I said, repeating the story I'd been telling myself for years. She wants security. Dad was the one who worked full-time. Now it's just her. I know what fear looks like, my grandmother said gently. So do you. Fear does not lie on loan applications. Fear does not hide credit card bills. Fear does not talk about cashing out every time a realtor knocks. That is greed. It is hunger with no bottom. She slid a lighter-colored document toward me, the legal text dense but neatly organized. Mr. Coleman at the clinic helped me draft this, she said. It is called a revocable living trust. Very simple. While I am alive, I am the trustee. I control the house. When I die, you become the trustee. The house belongs to the trust, not to a person, which makes it harder for someone to grab. And because the trust already owns it, it does not go through probate. No will contest. No surprises at some big dramatic reading. I stared at my name, printed clearly, successor trustee, Elena Ramirez. Why me? I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I liked. She smiled, lines fanning from the corners of her eyes. Because you already act like a trustee. You fix what is broken. You keep track of numbers. You pay your bills on time. You understand that a home is more than a chip in a card game. What about Mom? I whispered. She's going to feel betrayed. She is my daughter. I love her, but loving someone does not mean giving them a loaded gun when they've already shot holes in their own floor. She reached across the table, taking my hand. This is not about punishing her, Mija. It is about protecting you, and this house, from her worst impulses. We spent the next 2 hours going over the trust in detail. Mr. Coleman had written it in plain language, but my grandmother insisted on translating every term into stories. This paragraph, she said, pointing. That means if someone claims I didn't know what I was signing, whoever was there that day will testify that I did. This one. It says if anyone tries to challenge the trust in court without good reason, they can lose whatever small gifts they might have gotten otherwise. That's called a no contest clause. It makes people think twice before causing trouble. Neither of us said my mother's name. A week later, we met with Mr. Coleman in a cramped office that smelled faintly of mildew and coffee. My grandmother wore her Sunday dress and lipstick. She answered every question clearly. Her address, the date, what property she owned, who she wanted it to go to, and why. The notary watched her sign, then watched me sign as successor, trustee. The stamp thumped down with a sound that felt heavier than it should have. Keep this copy somewhere safe, Mr. Coleman told me, handing over a thick folder. Clerk's office will record the new deed. But never underestimate the power of a spare copy when someone forgets what was decided. My grandmother gave a little half-smile. We have shelves, she said, and my granddaughter has a good memory. For a while, nothing changed on the surface. Life went on. I finished my master's in education, started teaching at a nearby high school, came by the house most nights to eat dinner with my grandmother and grade papers at the dining table where my father's science projects had once sprawled. My mother still popped in and out, usually when she needed to borrow money or when a new realtor flyer showed up. You're too attached to this old brick, she'd say, glancing around. One lightning strike, and it's worth nothing. Think about what we could do with that equity. Grandma would pat the wall affectionately. This brick has already survived more storms than you have. Lila, she'd answer. We're fine. Then the small slips began, forgetting whether she'd turned off the stove, calling my father by his brother's name, losing a day here and there. The diagnosis, early Alzheimer's, came with a stack of pamphlets, and a soft-voiced neurologist who said things like planning ahead and support network. Grandma took it better than I did. We did our planning already, she said in the car on the way home from the doctor. Now it's just making sure you know where everything is. She wasn't wrong. Because of the trust, there wasn't a flurry of frantic paperwork. There were only the slow, painful logistics of decline. Home health aides, medication schedules, the endless emotional calculus of when to take away someone's car keys. My mother helped when it suited her. She'd swoop in with bags of takeout, criticize the aides I'd hired through Grandma's limited long-term care policy, and then disappear for weekends with a new boyfriend. Stop acting like a martyr. She'd tell me when I asked her to take a shift so I could sleep or grade. You chose this. You like being the hero. I chose my grandmother. I'd think. Not this. When Grandma finally passed, peacefully, in her own bed, rain tapping the windows the way she'd always liked, I was 33. We held the funeral at her church. People came from 4 neighborhoods over, bringing food and stories I'd never heard. My mother stood at the front, weeping just loud enough, accepting condolences with a grace that almost made me forget every fight we'd had. For 3 days, the house was full. When the last casserole dish had been returned and the final aunt had left, there were only 3 of us at the dining table, me, my mother, and the trust folder. So, Mom said, pushing aside a plate of half-eaten empanadas, "How are we going to handle this place? Sell and split? Or are you planning to stay here forever like a ghost?" My chest tightened. "We're not selling," I said carefully. "Grandma put the house into a trust. I'm the trustee. That means I manage it. I live here, pay the taxes, keep it up. If I have kids, it will go to them." Her laugh was sharp. "A trust? Since when?" "Since 3 years ago," I said. She talked to a lawyer. She wanted to make sure the house stayed in the family and wasn't sold off fast. "In the family," my mother repeated slowly. "And you think that means you? Only you?" "It means the trust," I said. "I'm responsible for it. We can still make decisions together about how to use it." "Don't you dare patronize me," she snapped, standing so fast her chair scraped the floor. "I am her daughter. This house should have been mine. She knew that. She promised me that. She promised you a lot of things," I said quietly. "She also promised my father she'd keep this house safe. She did what she thought best." "What she thought best for you," my mother spat. "You and your saint act. Always the good one. Always the responsible one. And I'm the what? The danger." I didn't answer. She leaned across the table, eyes blazing. "Fine," she said. "Play trustee. We'll see how long that lasts when the real world hits. You think a few pieces of paper can keep me out of what's mine? Watch me." She left the house that night with 2 suitcases and a fury that felt like a storm set on slow motion. For a while, nothing happened. I repaired the leaky bathroom, painted the guest room, planted tomatoes in the backyard. I kept teaching, kept drinking coffee in the sunroom every morning like my grandmother used to. My mother called occasionally, mostly to criticize my choices from a distance. "You should refinance while rates are low," she'd say. "You're sitting on at least $300,000 in equity." "I'm not pulling money out just to have a bigger mortgage," I'd reply. "Then at least rent it out." She'd insist. "You don't need all that space. Move into an apartment and make some real income. You're wasting opportunity." "Elena!" When I declined, the calls got shorter. Then they stopped. I should have known she was planning something. I didn't realize how far she'd go until a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door one Tuesday morning and handed me a thick envelope stamped with the seal of Fulton County Superior Court. Inside was a petition, Lila Ramirez versus Elena Ramirez, as trustee of the Ashby Street Trust. My mother was suing me. She wanted the trust declared invalid on grounds of undue influence, lack of capacity, and breach of natural expectations. She also requested that the court appoint her as successor trustee and beneficial owner, citing my alleged emotional instability after my grandmother's death and poor financial judgment in refusing to monetize the property. Tacked onto the complaint was a separate motion, petition for conservatorship over me. In black and white, under oath, my mother was claiming I was too fragile to manage my own affairs, too irresponsible to keep a house, too grief-addled to know what was best for myself. Reading it, my hands went numb. The walls of the house blurred, then sharpened. Finally, "Your house is mine," I heard her saying in the back of my mind. Not if I had anything to say about it. And thanks to my grandmother, and a lawyer who understood exactly what this kind of betrayal looked like, I did. Leah Patel's office sat on the 10th floor of a downtown building with a view of the gold-domed state capitol. Inside, it smelled like paper and jasmine tea. Diplomas lined the wall, along with framed thank you cards from clients who probably never thought they'd need a litigation attorney. "I'm sorry you're here," Leah said after skimming the petition, "but I'm glad you came early. We have time." She separated the stack into piles: trust challenge, conservatorship petition, supporting affidavits. My mother's handwriting peered at me from every page like tiny accusations. "She claims your grandmother lacked capacity when she signed the trust." Leah said that she didn't understand what she was doing and that you manipulated her. "That's not true," I said, hearing the desperation in my voice. "I believe you," Leah replied evenly. "The question is, can we prove you?" She asked about the trust signing. Who was there, what my grandmother had said, whether any video or audio existed. Mr. Coleman's notes, the neurologist's reports, church friends who'd heard my grandmother talk about her plans. I told her everything, grateful for every boring detail my grandmother had insisted on documenting. "Good," Leah said, making notes. "That gives us a strong defense on capacity and intent. Now, the conservatorship." She flipped to that section. There, in legalese softened by phrases like deep concern and out of love, my mother had written that after my grandmother's death, I had exhibited signs of depression, withdrawal, and irresponsible spending, including turning down lucrative offers to sell or refinance the property, and obsessing over preserving the house instead of planning realistically for her future. "She's using your grief against you," Leah said quietly. "She barely visited while Grandma was sick." I replied, "Now she's acting like she's rescuing me." Leah nodded. "Guardianship for an adult with a job, stable housing, and no major mental health diagnoses is a high bar," she said. "She'd have to show you can't manage your own affairs. From what you've told me, that's not remotely the case. But we'll gather evidence. Employment records, bank statements, maybe a letter from a therapist, if you're comfortable with that. I saw a counselor for a few months after Grandma died. I admitted it helped. I'm not broken." "Of course you're not," Leah said. "Seeking help is evidence of stability, not the opposite." Over the next few weeks, my life turned into a crash course in both law and betrayal. We pulled copies of every trust document, every recorded deed, every neurology note from the months around the signing. Mr. Coleman still worked at the church clinic. His file on my grandmother was meticulous. It included a client capacity checklist with boxes ticked and comments written in his neat, blocky handwriting. Understands assets. States clearly that she wants house to go to granddaughter Elena to protect property from sale. Does not appear coerced. We got a letter from Grandma's neurologist confirming that at the time of the trust, she was fully capable of understanding familiar financial decisions, and that her later decline did not retroactively erase that. Leah also dug into my mother's finances. Using discovery tools I still don't fully understand, she obtained bank statements, credit reports, and loan applications. She's overextended. Leah said, sliding a stack of papers across the table during one meeting. maxed credit cards, a home equity line of credit on her condo that's nearly tapped, a couple of personal loans. 2 months before she filed this suit, she applied for a cash-out refinance and listed the Ashby house as an asset she expected to inherit soon. She planned her budget around owning a house that wasn't hers. I said slowly, "Exactly," Leah replied. "Her security plan depends on a property your grandmother deliberately kept out of her reach. That's motive. Judges notice motive." Meanwhile, the conservatorship petition required its own defense. Leah had me undergo a psychological evaluation with an independent clinician. "It's not about whether you ever feel sad," Leah explained. "It's about whether you can understand your choices, handle your money, and take care of yourself. We're going to make the court's job easy." The psychologist asked about my work, my friendships, my daily routines. He looked at my budget spreadsheets, my savings account statements, the list of house repairs I'd scheduled over the past year. "At most, you meet criteria for normal bereavement," he wrote in his report. "No evidence of incapacity or impaired judgment. On the contrary, Ms. Ramirez appears organized, future-oriented, and insightful." We filed our response, a thick, calm rebuttal denying every allegation. Leah's language was clinical but edged with quiet steel. "The petitioner's dissatisfaction with the decedent's testamentary choices does not transform a valid trust into undue influence," she wrote, "nor does the respondent's refusal to liquidate a family home constitute financial irresponsibility. The law protects a person's right to plan their estate, even when those plans disappoint adult children." My mother, unsurprisingly, did not back down. Her next move was more desperate. Leah called me one afternoon, her voice tight. "She just filed a supplemental affidavit," she said, "claiming you've become increasingly erratic." The affidavit included statements from two of my mother's friends I barely knew, describing me as cold, obsessed with an old house, and hostile to any suggestion of change. One wrote that I'd snapped at her when she suggested renting out rooms on Airbnb. Another claimed I'd refused to attend a family barbecue because she had to stay home and guard her precious bricks. They made me sound unhinged. Leah wasn't impressed. "Annoyed isn't incapacitated," she said dryly. "If being snappy about unsolicited advice were grounds for guardianship, half the city would be under court supervision." Still, the sheer audacity of it rattled me. So did the deposition. Sitting across from my mother in a conference room, a court reporter clicking away at the end of the table, was like reliving every childhood argument with a microphone. Her attorney asked questions meant to paint a picture. "Ms. Ramirez," he said to me, "is it true that after your grandmother's death you stayed in the house alone for weeks and rarely left?" I took a month off work to grieve and handle her affairs. I replied, "I went to the grocery store, the bank, church. I wasn't hiding." "Is it true you turned down multiple offers from investors to buy the property for more than market value?" "Yes," I said. "My grandmother didn't want the house sold to flippers." She said so repeatedly. He pursed his lips. "Wouldn't accepting such an offer have provided significant financial benefit to both you and your mother?" "It would have gone against my grandmother's wishes," I said, "and against my own values." When it was my mother's turn, her story came out polished, rehearsed. "She used to be such a bubbly girl," Mom said sadly, eyes glistening. "But after my mother died, Elena withdrew. She stopped coming to family events. She spent all her time alone in that old house. I found bills piled up, dishes in the sink. I actually choked. That's not." "Don't speak," Leah murmured, touching my arm. "You'll get your turn." Mom continued. "I was terrified she'd sink into depression and lose everything. I just want to help her make smart choices. I want to make sure my mother's legacy isn't wasted by sentimentality." "Isn't it true?" Leah asked on cross-examination, that 2 months before filing this petition, you applied for a refinance loan listing the Ashby property as an asset you expected to inherit. Mom's jaw tightened. I was planning ahead. Planning for whose benefit? Leah pressed. For the family's, Mom answered. By family, Leah said, flipping to another page. Do you mean yourself? Because the loan application lists only your name and your debts, not Elena's. My mother didn't respond. Step by step, document by document, Leah built a picture of someone less like a concerned parent and more like a gambler counting on someone else's chips. By the time the trial date arrived, I'd memorized more legal terminology than I ever wanted. Burden of proof, preponderance of evidence, intent, capacity, fiduciary duty. But the heart of it came down to something simple. Had my grandmother known what she was doing when she put her house into a trust? And was I competent to honor that choice? The answer to both was yes. We just had to convince a judge, which is how I found myself back in that courtroom, listening to my mother declare, "Finally, your house is mine," as if she were announcing a foregone conclusion instead of betting everything on a story that was about to crumble under its own weight. Leah's opening statement was the opposite of dramatic. She stood, adjusted her glasses, and spoke in a tone that reminded me of my best teachers, the kind who made complicated things understandable without dumbing them down. This case is about respect, she told the judge. Respect for a woman's right to decide what happens to her home. Respect for legal planning done carefully and in good faith. And respect for the difference between grief and incapacity. She outlined the timeline. My grandparents buying the house, my grandmother's meeting with Mr. Coleman to create the trust, the doctor's assessment of her mental clarity, my role as caregiver and successor trustee, my mother's mounting debts, her failed refinance application, the sudden flurry of accusations. The petitioner is entitled to feel disappointed by her mother's choices. Leah said, she is not entitled to rewrite them. My mother's attorney responded with more flair. He spoke of family expectations, natural orders, cultural norms in which the eldest daughter assumes the matriarch's role, including her home. He painted me as well-meaning but emotionally fragile, clinging to a house as a substitute for moving on. "Mrs. Ramirez," he said when he called my mother to the stand, "did you ever discuss with your mother what would happen to the Ashby Street house?" "Hundreds of times," my mother answered, her voice shaking just the right amount. She always said, "When I'm gone, this will help you retire, Lila. You've worked too hard." I relied on that. I made financial decisions based on that promise. "What financial decisions?" he prompted. "I took a lower-paying job to care for her. When she was sick," my mother said, "I helped with bills. I didn't save for my own mortgage because I knew I'd have the house." I bit back a laugh. Leah's hand tightened briefly on my arm, warning me. My mother went on. Then, suddenly, Elena moved in, and everything changed. She started taking over. She convinced my mother that no one else could be trusted with the house. On Elena's good days, she's very persuasive. On her bad days, she can be cold. "Why do you believe your mother lacked capacity when she signed the trust?" her lawyer asked. "She was already forgetting things," my mother said. "She called me by the wrong name, thought my father was still alive. She didn't know what day it was half the time. There's no way she fully understood she was cutting me out." "And what made you file for conservatorship over your daughter?" he added. "I've seen her spiral," my mother said, looking at me with a performance of pain. "She isolates. She obsesses. She refuses opportunities that would benefit us both. I'm scared she'll lose the house or end up in debt. And then what was all my mother's sacrifice for?" On cross-examination, Leah was almost gentle. "Mrs. Ramirez," she said, "you testified that your mother often said the house would help you retire. Did she ever put that promise in writing?" "No," my mother admitted, but she did put her intention to leave the house in trust to Elena in writing. Correct. Leah held up the trust. In this document, signed and notarized. She didn't know what she was signing, my mother replied. You were not present at that signing, were you? No, but... So, your belief about her confusion is based on assumption, not direct observation of that day. Leah said, Is that fair to say? My mother pressed her lips together. She was confused around that time. Yet, Leah continued. Her neurologist's notes state that on the date of the trust, she was oriented, understood her diagnosis, and was capable of handling familiar financial matters. Do you have any medical training that would contradict that? No. Leah shifted. Let's talk about your financial decisions. Is it true that 2 months before you filed this lawsuit, you applied for a refinance loan listing the Ashby house as an asset you expected to inherit? My mother hesitated. Yes. And that the loan application did not list Elena as co-borrower or beneficiary. Only you? Yes, but is it also true that you currently carry balances on 3 credit cards, a personal loan, and a line of credit totaling approximately $85,000? Leah asked, glancing at her notes. My mother flushed. Everyone has debt. Everyone does not forge a financial plan around a house someone else already legally owns. Leah replied calmly. One more question, Mrs. Ramirez. When you told this court, finally, your house is mine, were you expressing concern for your daughter's well-being or satisfaction at the prospect of erasing your debts with the equity in that property? My mother's mouth opened and closed. I just meant justice. My mother wanted me taken care of. No further questions, Leah said. Then it was my turn on the stand. Leah guided me through my life step by step. My job, my salary, my budget, the repairs I'd made to the house, the fact that I'd never missed a tax payment or mortgage due, the small one we kept for insurance purposes, my months of counseling after my grandmother's death. Why was it important to you to honor your grandmother's wish not to sell to investors? She asked. Because she bought that house when people like us weren't supposed to. I said, my throat tight. She wanted it to be a home, not a chip in someone else's game. She knew the neighborhood was changing. She didn't want to be the cautionary tale of the abuela who lost her house because her family couldn't manage their impulses. Harlan tried to rattle me on cross-examination. Ms. Ramirez, he said, isn't it true that you turned down an offer $200,000 above market value? Yes, I answered. It came from a developer who planned to tear the house down and build luxury townhomes. My grandmother specifically told me not to sell to anyone who would destroy the house for profit. And isn't it possible, he pressed, that your refusal was less about honoring her wishes and more about your own emotional attachment? Those things aren't mutually exclusive. I said, I can love the house and still make a rational decision to keep it. You've refused to share ownership with your mother, he added. Why not compromise? Put her on the title. Let her feel secure. Because every conversation we've had about the house has ended with her talking about selling or refinancing. I said, putting her on the title would be giving her a loaded gun pointed at the thing I've spent my adult life protecting. Do you see your mother as your enemy? He asked, pouncing. I paused, choosing honesty over politeness. I see her as someone who makes decisions from fear and desperation. I said, I don't hate her, but I don't trust her with something my grandmother worked 60 years for. Leah called our final witnesses, Mr. Coleman, who testified about the trust signing and my grandmother's clarity of mind, and Dr. Nguyen, the neurologist, who explained the difference between memory loss and incapacity in simple terms that made even the bailiff look engaged. Did Ms. Ramirez, the elder, have dementia? Leah asked. Yes, Dr. Nguyen said. But dementia does not mean a person is incapable of any decisions. On the date in question, my notes reflect that she understood her assets and her desire to protect her home. She knew who her heirs were. That meets the legal standard for capacity. As closing arguments wrapped, my heart pounded so loudly, I was sure the microphones could pick it up. My mother's attorney begged the judge to consider fairness and family history. Leah asked her to consider the law. The question is not who needs the house more, she said. It is who it belongs to. Rosa Ramirez answered that clearly while she was alive. We are simply asking the court to listen. Judge Hall took a recess. When she returned, everyone rose. The air felt thick. I have reviewed the pleadings, testimony, and exhibits carefully, she began, voice measured. This is at its core, a dispute between a mother and daughter about the home of the previous generation. Such disputes are unfortunately common. What is less common is when one party goes so far as to seek guardianship over a competent adult in an attempt to gain control of property. My stomach flipped. On the issue of the trust, the judge continued, I find that Rosa Ramirez had the requisite capacity at the time of execution. The testimony of her attorney and neurologist, along with contemporaneous notes, established that she understood the nature of her assets and the consequences of placing the Ashby Street property into a revocable trust with her granddaughter as successor trustee. The petitioner has provided no credible evidence of undue influence beyond her own disappointment. The trust is valid. My mother made a strangled sound. On the petition for conservatorship, Judge Hall said, turning a page, the standard is high. The court must be convinced that the respondent is unable to manage her own affairs or provide for her health and safety. The evidence shows that Ms. Elena Ramirez is employed full-time, pays her bills, maintains her home, and has sought appropriate mental health care when needed. The psychological evaluation indicates no incapacity. To the contrary, Ms. Ramirez appears to be functioning at a high level. The petition is therefore denied and dismissed with prejudice. She looked directly at my mother. Mrs. Ramirez, she said, I understand that you may feel hurt by your mother's estate planning choices, but the law allows individuals to favor one heir over another, especially when there are sound reasons for doing so. Your attempt to secure this house through litigation and an unwarranted guardianship petition is troubling. I strongly suggest you seek financial counseling and reevaluate how you pursue security in your later years. This court will not be used as a tool to override a valid trust or to punish an adult child for honoring her grandmother's wishes. Her gavel came down with a sharp crack. We are adjourned. For a moment, no one moved. Then the rustle of people standing, the murmur of voices. My knees felt weak, but Leah's hand on my elbow steadied me. You're still trustee, she said softly. The house is still yours to protect. My mother stood abruptly, knocking her chair back. She turned toward me, eyes blazing. This isn't over, she hissed. You think you've won because some judge believed your story? You wouldn't even have that house if it weren't for me. I met her gaze, something inside me finally settling. I have the house because Grandma chose me, I said quietly. You lost today because you tried to take what wasn't yours. She opened her mouth, then snapped it shut, tears of fury gathering in her eyes. For a second, I thought she might say she was sorry, that we'd find some way back from this. Instead, she turned on her heel and stalked out of the courtroom, her lawyer hustling after her. Outside, the Atlanta sun was bright. Reporters hovered near the steps, sniffing around for a Family Feud over house story. Leah steered me past them. We walked in silence until we reached the parking garage. Do you regret fighting? She asked quietly as we reached my car. I thought about my grandmother's hands smoothing the trust papers, the jar under the floorboard, the way she'd looked at the house like a shield. I thought about my mother's voice declaring, finally, your house is mine, as if love and entitlement were the same thing. No, I said, I regret that it came to this. But I don't regret defending her choice. Or myself. In the months that followed, The legal ripples slowly faded. The case became a footnote in some property law blog. The house remained in the trust, my name still on the documents tucked in the safe behind a row of cookbooks. My mother downsized her condo after her refinance attempts dried up. Word about the failed guardianship spread quietly through our extended family and her church. Some people took her side. Others kept their distance, wary of becoming collateral in her next attempt to lever someone else's assets. We saw each other at a cousin's wedding once. She avoided my eyes. I didn't force a conversation that neither of us was ready for. Instead, I poured my energy into the life the house allowed me to build. I turned the sunroom into a small tutoring space, helping neighborhood kids with college essays and poetry. I hosted book clubs in the living room, the shelves lined with my grandmother's worn Spanish novels and my own collection of classics. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I sat on the front steps with a cup of café con leche and watched the streetlights blink on one by one. The gentrification my grandmother had feared still crept closer. New condos rising where old duplexes had fallen, trendy restaurants replacing corner bodegas. But our brick house remained stubborn and steady. Keeping it wasn't about clinging to the past anymore. It was about honoring the work it took to plant a flag when everything around you said you had no right to. People like to say blood is thicker than water, as if that means family can do no wrong. What I've learned is that blood can also be the first currency people trade when they're scared of drowning. My grandmother gave me something rarer than an inheritance, permission to draw a line, to say, this is mine to protect, even when the person trying to cross it shares my face. If you've ever had to stand up to a parent who thought your stability, your home, or your future was theirs to spend, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Because the bravest moments often happen not in grand speeches, but in quiet decisions to sign the paper that protects you, to hire the lawyer, to show up in court, and sit still while someone you once trusted tells the world your life should belong to them. Sometimes, the real victory isn't just keeping a house. It's finally understanding that no one, not even the person who raised you, gets to declare your life is mine and have the law or your heart agree.